the official
curriculum.
the curriculum of any university, you'll only find a proper exposition of it here. Okay, so I hope all of that was quite clear. It's not a particularly difficult concept to understand, and this is just an extension really of what we were doing yesterday. Okay, so you can think about it, you can think about some kind of system, and you had the capital, labour, and debt. Okay. The first lecture we looked at incremental changes to output from adding 1 unit of marginal labour. Second lecture yesterday was me doing the same procedure with capital, and there we had the exact definition of marginal productivity of capital in a similar vein to marginal productivity of debt. You look at the total output caused by the application of 1 unit of capital relative to the cost of that marginal unit of capital. And then finally, we went through debt, marginal productivity of debt. Now, these are just the main factors that one would look at. You might have many more. You might look at the marginal productivity of something completely new. But that's the whole point about this form of analysis. We're not assuming that output is solely from these 3 facets. If there's another facet that we think has an influence on output, well, then the same exercise can be done again. You know, so there's nothing to restrict this form of analysis. Obviously, you have to take into account how other things might be influencing the variable that you're trying to look at. And that is this whole point about changing one thing, but keeping everything else the same, and doing it for each of the variables that you want to look at. Okay? So, there we have it. Marginal productivity of debt, negative in 2006, if not already a lot more negative, as Keith was saying, if you aggregate everything as you truly should be aggregating it. And so the consequence of further deficits, further monetization, is not going to be beneficial. It's not going to have any nominal increase to total output. Maybe that will take 2 or 3 years to see in obvious fashion, but the signs are already there. And as Professor said, there's difference between the way that people aggregate all of these figures. Some people have yet to see it go negative. They're sort of saying 2015. If you look at the data as it's presented from the Treasury, we went negative for the first time in 2006. At the moment, though, we're positive at half. So for each dollar of debt put into the system, apparently we get $0.50 of extra output. But I wouldn't believe that at the moment.
Actually, I think there's, if I can interject, I think there's an analogy to a black hole and the event horizon of 1. Once you get to less than 1, you have the dilemma that every additional dollar is producing less than $1 of GDP. And of course, if you stop the borrowing, then GDP is going to fall further, so they have to keep doing it. Once you fall below 1, I think the spiral into the singularity at the center is a given, unless you change the game in some way.
And we will be talking about how you should change the game, and it involves gold bonds, but that's not the topic of this conference.
A very large part of this problem is, of course, the explosion of debt, the absolute number, which shows the magnitude of the debt. And we actually put our finger on the reason for this, because gold has been forcibly removed from the system in 1973. Well, the date you can't pinpoint it, because when first Nixon announced that he's going to default on the short-term debt, international debt of the United States, the impression was given that this is a temporary measure. We might go back to gold. We are not throwing gold out yet. So it took another 2 years. It was not clear which way the cat will jump. And in 1973, they officially announced that gold was being eliminated from the system, from the international monetary system. And as a consequence, we know, and the amazing thing is that economists at the time didn't even look at this problem, but we know that if you remove gold, you are removing the only ultimate extinguisher of debt. Because if there is no gold, what they call repayment of debt is not really a repayment. It's just shifting debt. So if I was indebted and I paid whatever, check or Federal Reserve notes or euros or yens, this was only a shift. I have unloaded my burden, but it didn't disappear. It is now a burden carried by the bank, which gave me this checking account. Or the bank could pass it on to the Federal Reserve. Well, ultimately, it is all being kicked upstairs to the US Treasury, because the US Treasury guarantees the Federal Reserve banks, and the Federal Reserve banks guarantee not only the US banks, but also foreign central banks which keep their reserves in US Treasury paper. So that is not being reduced, total debt in the world. It can only increase. Now this is pretty incredible, isn't it? That they tamper with the mechanism which worked for hundreds of years and remove the ultimate extinguisher of debt, and they think that we can live happily ever after. This is really what is going on. So that's why the picture is so dim. Not at all promising, no way out.
I think it's worth emphasizing here that when we say ultimate extinguisher of debt, that doesn't mean that under an unadulterated gold standard, as we call it, that doesn't mean that the majority of payments, volume of payments, are made in gold coin. Not at all.
No.
It's the ultimate extinguisher of debt, not the only extinguisher of debt. So if I had a debt with an individual, I would be more than happy to take fine gold bills of exchange as a payment rather than gold coin. Maybe a bond, probably negotiate a bit more on the face value. But the point is that the majority of payments, the vast majority of payments under an unadulterated gold standard will not be done in gold coin. they would be done in a claim to gold coin, which matured with pretty much guaranteed results.
But that's exactly what they've removed.
And that's what they've removed, you know. Gold is the silent witness. Only at the margin did it really move around. And the whole thing about an unadulterated gold standard is that if everything is denominated and measured in terms of gold, it forces physical gold into circulation, because no one who's sane would want to keep physical gold coin over a fine bill of exchange. You know, it's an earning asset. The last thing you want is a large balance of gold sovereigns, you know, unless you're in the process of hoarding, again, which there's no problem with. I've got no problem with hoarding. Hoarding is an integral part of the interest rate mechanism. You know, but so that's just one thing to bear in mind. If you read somewhere that a gold standard is not practical, those people don't understand what a true gold standard is. Okay, Louis?
Yeah, just want to make a point. I think that's important. When you say gold is the ultimate extinguisher of debt, you mean without loss.
You mean what?
Without loss?
Without loss, because...
Oh yeah, well, that's...
No, but I think, you know, the other way to extinguish debt is to default. You know, debt, what matters in debt is who pays for it.
I think that's like
It's
saying
not always the creditor.
the only way out of this golding is to use the front door. Of course, if a meteor were to strike this golding and we all die, that's another way to leave. Not necessarily the preferable way.
Well,
It ruins your credit.
well, it will be interesting if you say later on we'll have a lecture on how do we move on to reset.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm adding this very quickly here. Don't believe anything that you read about a gold standard unless it's from one of us, because you're all laughing, I'm not laughing. Okay, they don't understand, they really don't understand what we mean by a gold standard. And frankly, I have no idea what they mean by a gold standard, so that's good as far as I'm concerned. I've been reading a lot that they want to peg the US dollar to gold, and you know, I mean, I don't want to do that, none of us here want to do that, and that, I think we'd conclude, would be utter failure at some point, so stick to us.
Been there, done that. That didn't work.
It didn't work.
Now, the underlying philosophy of the official economics, as it's being taught at universities today, is that the US dollar is the ultimate extinguisher of debt, because you can always roll it over. So when the debt matures, it's just a matter of bookkeeping to print new bonds and put a more distant maturity date, and that can go on forever. Now, what is different today is that we have a proof now, which everybody can look at and evaluate it, that the so-called sovereign debt crisis is just a denial of that axiom. The government cannot abuse that in this way. Just roll it over forever and don't worry, because the government has the power to create value out of nothing. So right now, what they talk about is the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. especially in Euroland, but also in Britain and those countries which are outside of the European community. But watch for the day when the headlines will talk about the sovereign debt crisis of the United States, because that's the end of the road. The buck stops right there. But they are not yet talking about it, only Europe. Because the European governments are irresponsible, they are lying like Greek government or the Spanish or Irish or whatever, you see. But in the United States they know the rules and they stick with it and so on and so forth. You see, if it was possible to create an ultimate extinguisher of that paper money in the United States, it would be possible to create make the euro that way, make the yen that way. But this is the proof now, and you can just look at it, look at the evidence and see what is happening. There will be a sovereign debt crisis of the United States as well. And it's just a matter of time, and not a long period of time either. I think you can add to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the interesting thing to observe, and it probably has surprised a lot of America bashers, is A, how strong the dollar is at the moment against the other currencies, and B, how it has actually, all of these crises have initiated outside of the United States first, and are being drawn towards it. Okay? Never was it the case that America collapsed and then the world collapsed. Okay? The world is collapsing around America, and America is going to be the last one to collapse, as Professor said. But when America collapses, I don't know whether we'll already be in ruins, in Europe, but that will be the end of the game, full stop. And we're approaching it very quickly, very, very quickly indeed. So America being the last one to go through this, as I think they will, France, Italy, Spain, will all be in destitution before America is, in my view. This is to do with the fact that the dollar has a slower declining marginal utility than any other currency. Even though it is still declining, it's declining at a much lower rate for the dollar than it is for any other currency. And that's part of the reason why the euro is trading at 125 or whatever it is against the dollar, when the majority of people would have expected it to have been at 2 by now.
Is the euro now stronger or weak?
Marginally. I mean, having fallen like that, it's just done that. So it's not.
Since late July, the euro has rallied against the dollar. It was $1.20 in around July 20, and now it's $1.26.
What was the lowest?
$1.20
That was the absolute.
This year.
this year.
Oh, this year was
That
the
was
lower
July.
earlier.
I think in 2008 it was lower, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think it was $1.16 or something.
We were below par in 2000 or 99 when it first started.
80 cents.
Yeah, 80 cents was the all-time low.
Really?
Yeah, 1999. That was in 99, wasn't it? Or 2000?
We're sure, because
Well, there
we
was
started
no-
at 30 and then they fell off.
No, when it was first introduced, it fell below par to 80 cents.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh. So that's the early history.
That's the early history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and then it established itself at a much. What was the?
The peak was 136,
140,
140. Yeah,
40 something.
40 something.
Yeah, $1.46.
Yeah.
Anyway, currencies have nothing to do with that.
Rudy.
Sandy, looking at this circle, capital is kind of in two forms. One is invested capital, the real machinery, the physical stuff, and then there's cash lying around. But actually that cash is also debt or debt back.
Yes.
So this makes it a little bit, so my question is, you say US will be the last. What about China? I mean, China's got real capital, real wealth. It's all the manufacturing's gone there, and their currency potentially could outlast the dollar. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, might do, but I'm just thinking that they've got how many trillions of dollars worth of US treasuries in their bank vault.
So they got the landmine in their vault.
Yeah, and I don't know how they've pyramided that. They must have pyramided that locally somehow.
It's starting to come out, by the way, regarding China, just how crooked their banking system is, and just how much bad debt is piled on top of bad debt, because it's all centrally commanded. The central government says to the provinces, you will attain a GDP growth rate of X, and then the provinces borrow money, order the banks to lend them money, and then they fund these projects for which there's no real demand. That's starting to hit now, and that may give the answer to your question in the next couple of months. It's just how bad the problem is.
It's all mere speculation on currencies because it's based on the existing nature of the currencies, and that could change at any moment in any country. And who knows what the Chinese have done with their paper reserves? They've probably already swapped it for commodities in Africa. You know, why not?
Well, someone must own them. Whoever owns whoever they swapped it with, be careful with them. Don't have them as your counterparty. So there we have it. We're coming up to 11 o'clock. Yeah, you wanted to ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Questions are meant to be at the end of, but we'll make an exception. Go.
Okay, thank you. Is your definition of money an extinguisher of debt?
Ultimate.
An ultimate extinguisher of debt rather than a medium of exchange? If that is the case, then why?
Medium of exchange to me is just a consequence of that. It's not. Professor, how would you define money?
Most marketable good there is.
Most marketable good. Now, medium of exchange, ultimate extinguisher of debt, you could say is a consequence of that. Rudy?
I would say medium of exchange is one of the functions of money. That's carrying value in a horizontal sense from one place to another. In a vertical sense, it's carrying value into the future. And as a numeraire, that's its third function, but not the definition.
Okay, and the second question is, if you call gold, then can you really call gold an ultimate extinguisher of debt? Because in the case of the collapse of the financial system and therefore the division of labor, and people will have to, their money will be not worth anything, and they'll rather get potatoes and salt and trade whatever with the local farmers rather than gold. I agree that gold will become, in a world of division of labor and no fiat currencies, gold will become the best money. But can you really say it is the ultimate extinguisher of gold? I mean, it gives it such an absolute value which it doesn't necessarily have. It is dependent on the subjective.
First of all, I mean, you should separate being hungry from having a debt. You know, of course, if you're hungry, then but that's not a debt. You know, the only thing that will extinguish that is having food. You know, it's beyond that.
If I have some tools and the other person has some milk, and or I don't have any tools, and he gives me milk, then I owe him something. Yeah, but he doesn't necessarily want gold. He might want some tools. So can you really give it such an absolute value?
Well, if you borrowed a cup of sugar, if I borrowed a cup of sugar from the professor, it would be unusual if I paid him back in gold coin.
Yeah, okay, of course, because it's big. But
you know, but paying back in sugar is acceptable. All I'm saying is that it's the ultimate. All we're saying is it's the ultimate. If you have a debt, and I'm not talking about if you have a debt and you're starving, okay? If you have a debt and if you have a debt owed to you, and you're comfortable, you're leading a bourgeois existence, otherwise, you know, then it will be gold. That's the ultimate.
If I can just interject here.
Conditions.
Ultimate is,
I just think it's missing to say ultimate because it gives such absolute value and which.
let me just interject here.
Ultimate that is always valid.
Ultimate does not mean we're comparing gold to sugar or gold to milk. Ultimate means we're comparing gold to the bond. We're comparing gold to a real bill. And both of those, ultimately, i.e. at the end of the day, those things have to be settled in terms of gold. That's what ultimate means. It doesn't mean that gold is better than sugar, gold is better than wheat. It is, that's a separate discussion of why those are not the most marketable good. In this context, ultimate extinguisher means if I extinguish my debt to the professor by giving him a bill, and he extinguishes his debt to Sandeep by giving him a bond, at the end of the day, those must be settled in gold. That's what ultimate means. It means at the end of the day. Does that make sense?
There's no counterparty liability.
And debt as we know it nowadays. Well, this is just a rhetorical, semantic disagreement. That's all.
Well, I think the last thing he started to say is no counterparty to gold. And that's what he meant ultimate at the end of the line, at the end of the day, when the debt travels around, what happens to it? Does it hang around forever and keep growing, or is it extinguished? And then you can say gold is the best extinguisher of debt. In reality, any present good could extinguish debt. You could send over 10 tons of sugar to extinguish monetary debt, but who wants that? Or you could use silver, which is also pretty good, but again, if it's a large debt, it would take a lot of it. So the best one, it's in a way, we didn't talk about that, but also by ultimately means in a way that, where does it end? Where does the debt end? And there is gold sitting around and hidden in people's little holes in their backyards or sitting in the vault, gathering dust, when it should be doing its job, which is to ultimately extinguish all this debt. And that's what it means. Not
once the gold coin is paid, there is no more debt.
Right.
That's not a matter of semantics, and that cannot be debated. If I owe you money and I give you gold, nobody owes anybody any money.
Yeah, of course.
No money is owed anymore. The debt goes out of existence.
Yeah, of course.
That's what ultimate extinguisher of debt means. Nothing more than that.
Okay, we've hit 11 o'clock. We'll have a half-hour coffee break, and back at 11:30 for Professor's second morning lecture on...
Ludwig, would you like to make the announcement now or at the beginning of...
We can make the announcement right now.
Yeah, make it now.
There is going to be the awarding of